The West Philippine Sea, a sea teeming with marine life, an abundant source of livelihood for the people living around it. Its strategic location makes it an important shipping route around the world. The West Philippine Sea contains a number of island chains, rocks, and reefs. It is a semi-enclosed sea surrounded by Brunei, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, and Vietnam. It has recently been discovered that there are large reserves of oil and natural gas here. The importance of the South China Sea is undeniable. It is this importance that made nations defend and exploit their share of the sea. It also caused some nations to overstep their boundaries. This created an international disagreement regarding the sovereignty over various maritime and geologic features within it. What are the bases of these countries' claims? What actions have been done to enforce their claims and protect their interests? Which country has lawful claims over which areas? Will these legitimate claims be enforced by the presiding body? More importantly, will the privilege of a lawful claim, in one way or another, translate to enjoying sovereignty over the areas? In order to have a lawful and widely accepted basis as to who should enjoy sovereignty over which areas, it is essential to understand an international law relevant in our current generation, the UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It was signed by both Philippines and China. Also known as the Law of the Sea Treaty, the UNCLOS is the international agreement that resulted from the Third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea. It defines the rights and responsibilities of nations with respect to their use of the world's oceans, establishing guidelines for business, the environment, and the management of marine natural resources. The convention covers almost all human uses of the seas: navigation and overflight, resource exploration and exploitation, conservation and pollution, fishing, and shipping. It speaks of a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, wherein coastal nations should be able to exploit natural resources. Sadly, China disobeys some provisions of the UNCLOS, choosing to use historical claims as their basis to acquire territory. This is contrary to China's involvement in the ASEAN 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. Representatives from various Southeast Asian nations, including Philippines, China, and Vietnam, attended and signed the Code of Conduct. It included provisions that state that universally recognized principles of international law, including the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, should be used in resolving territorial and jurisdictional disputes. If the UNCLOS would be effectively enforced by the United Nations, and if all the nations who accepted it would obey it, it would please most of the nations involved, since most of them only claim areas that fall within their respective exclusive economic zone. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Let us first set our eyes upon the three nations most affected by the dispute: China, the most aggressive claimant in the dispute; Vietnam, a major occupant of a lot of features in the South China Sea; and the Philippines, a nation that has taken a legal approach on the issue, using internationally accepted laws as their basis. According to China, their claims stem from historical accounts suggesting they have been parts of China for more than 2,000 years. Employing their heavily debated 9-dash line, China claims to have indisputable sovereignty over 85% of the West Philippine Sea. Stakeholders in Southeast Asia expectedly disagreed with China's claims, mainly because, just by glancing at the map, the claim looks unfair and it trespasses territorial boundaries defined by accepted international laws.
The whole point is that you claim resources of the sea based on the land. You don't just say, all this sea belongs to us without measuring the distance. So that's the important thing, the difference between UNCLOS and China's U-shaped line claim, is that China's U-shaped line claim is not based on the distance from the land. It's based on the idea that this is historically China's, without providing any kind of legal basis for that.
Nung mga dekada 70, alam mo, ang bansang Vietnam at ang bansang China, meron silang pinag-aawayan na grupo ng isla doon sa norte. Ang tawag dito Paracels. Pero nung dekada 70, ang bansang China gumamit ng puwersa para patalsikin yung mga sundalo ng Vietnam doon. Hindi po tayo nagreklamo. Wala pong nagreklamo. Kasi ang tingin natin, ang tingin ng ibang bansa, wala naman kaming pakialam dyan dahil hindi naman kami apektado. Later on, dekada 80, mula doon sa Paracels, bumaba po sila, nandoon na sila sa Spratlys. Doon po sa isang feature na tinatawag nating Fiery Cross Reef, nagkaroon po ng sagupaan ang bansang China at bansang Vietnam, mga 80 katao, sundalo ng Vietnam, namatay. Doon po hindi rin tayo nagreklamo kasi medyo lagpas ng 200 yung lugar. At sinasabi natin, problema ng Vietnam at ng China yan. Nung dekada 90, tayo na po ang sumunod.
It was in the 1995 Chinese occupation of the Mischief Reef that the Philippines began to take note of the dispute. Mischief Reef is located a mere 124 nautical miles away from the Philippine coastline in Palawan, well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It is visibly much further away from China's southernmost territory, Hainan. It got the Philippines' attention because of the land reclamation being done there. China started developing by building a guard post and shelters in the area, saying there were rest houses for fishermen. These rest houses were actually bunkers and garrisons. China's militarization wasn't taken lightly by its neighbors. A series of armed encounters and standoffs occurred in efforts to defend what the nations perceived was rightfully theirs. Throughout all the disagreements, the Philippines and Vietnam have maintained a good relationship throughout the dispute, basically because the two nations acknowledge each other's claims. In 2012, China made their move on the Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines had been exercising sovereignty over the shoal since the Spanish colonial period. In fact, in recent times, the Philippine Navy was able to regularly drive away foreign fishing vessels from the area. In April of 2012, the Philippine Navy spotted 8 Chinese fishing vessels anchored in a lagoon at Scarborough Shoal. After inspecting the boats, the Filipinos discovered that the China was engaged in illegal fishing and harvesting of endangered marine species. Backup came from China, thus preventing the arrests of the erring Chinese fishermen. It resulted in a standoff between the two nations. Both nations agreed to leave the area, but only the Filipinos did. Ever since then, China became the one driving foreign fishers away from the area. The main offense being committed by China is their disregard for international laws. These laws give the coastal state the right to exploit natural sources within their given boundaries. China should have the consent of the coastal state before exploiting any natural resources. On top of exploiting natural resources, China also boxes out coastal states from the areas they occupy, not allowing them to enjoy their well-deserved natural resources. On top of that, they created artificial islands on which they mainly built military infrastructures. This raised problems for every nation in the area, since the freedom in the high seas and in features within nations' exclusive economic zones is being challenged. The high seas have always been part of the global commons. They shouldn't be subject to sovereignty by any state. It is especially problematic for the Philippines, since China is slowly enforcing their claims well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Philippines responded to China, asserting its claims by invoking the UNCLOS. Furthermore, the Philippines showcased their oldest known map, the Villar de Murillo map of 1734, which discredits China's claims on the Scarborough Shoal. In response to China closing the Scarborough Shoal to Filipinos, the Philippines filed an arbitration case against them on January 2013, under the auspices of the UNCLOS. The Philippine claims center around maritime law issues, although China asserts that they cannot be resolved without deciding territorial issues first. For that reason, China has largely refused to participate in the proceedings, although it has drafted and publicly released a position paper opposing the tribunal's jurisdiction. The Philippines has submitted its memorial as well as a response to China's position paper, and both nations are currently awaiting a decision from the tribunal as to its own jurisdiction. As the case proceeds in the background, China has adopted an increasingly assertive posture in the region. In early May 2014, a Chinese state-owned oil company moved one of its rigs into waters claimed by Vietnam south of the Paracel Islands. This provocation touched off confrontations between Vietnamese and Chinese vessels around the rig, as well as rioting against foreign-owned businesses in parts of Vietnam. Additionally, over the last year, Beijing has launched an accelerating land reclamation campaign across the West Philippine Sea. In at least 7 locations, Chinese vessels have poured tons of sand to expand the size of features occupied by China. Beijing has also begun construction of infrastructure on much of this reclaimed land, including an airstrip capable of receiving military aircraft. Although other claimants have reclaimed land in the past, China has reclaimed 2,000 acres of new land, more than all of the other claimants combined over the history of their claims, according to the U.S. Department of Defense.
China is claiming, in fact, the entire South China Sea, and under UNCLOS, you cannot claim an entire sea. You have to base your maritime claims from your land. You measure it from your coast. Now, the 9 dashed lines are not measured from China's coast. China doesn't explain where, from how it drew those lines. China hasn't given the coordinates for those lines. They just say, basta we own it since 2,000 years ago. That's not UNCLOS, because when UNCLOS was negotiated, many countries claimed 500 nautical miles, 600 nautical miles. Some claim only 200, some 12. So there had to be a compromise. And a compromise was struck. And this was the reason why we have UNCLOS, because there was this big compromise. Everybody agreed that all coastal states will have 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone. China actively participated. China, in fact, led a group of 77 countries in certain issues. So China knew about this compromise. And that compromise meant that everybody gets 200 nautical miles, but they have to waive all other historic claims to all other waters.
Correct.
You're just entitled to 200. And you waive everything else so that there will be stability in the oceans and seas of our planet. Now China is saying, yes, we are entitled to 200 nautical mile EEZ, but we also claim the entire South China Sea because of historic rights.
Right.
But, I mean, they cannot do that. We already all agreed that all historic rights are extinguished. When UNCLOS was signed, historic rights were extinguished and everybody had a 200 nautical mile and a possibility for an additional 150 nautical mile if you can prove a natural prolongation of your continental shelf. That's all.
Yeah.
You cannot claim beyond that.
What should alarm everyone is the fact that China firmly believes in their indisputable sovereignty over the maritime zones within their 9 dash line, and they have the means to defend their occupied areas well enough to reclaim the land there. China's navy is substantially stronger than every nation involved, not to mention having the largest army in the world. They also have the second highest GDP in the world and is estimated to be the world's largest economy by 2020. There is no doubt China can't be fought eye for an eye. The Philippines' usage of laws and filing cases to tribunals seems to be the best way for justice to prevail. If international laws could unanimously be the basis for maritime disputes, the Philippines should have a strong, credible argument against China's intrusions. The problem is, China doesn't seem to respect let alone obey the international laws. This threatens the image of UNCLOS, which could cause other nations to lose respect and maybe also disobey the UNCLOS provisions. It will also cause people to question the United Nations' principal judicial organ, the International Court of Justice, and its capability to uphold international law. Until the law is properly enforced, China will have the upper hand by continuing to be able to do most of what they want to do. The best thing we can do, apart from waiting for the results of the Philippines arbitration case, is to create awareness and educate stakeholders about the issue. China is blatantly committing a theft of the global commons, and everyone involved should be concerned about this. In the beginning, Philippines mostly didn't give much attention to conflicts between China and Vietnam until they themselves became a stakeholder in the dispute. As the saying goes, prevention is better than the cure. Creating awareness of the issue helps assure that nations and their governments are ready if ever China decides to intrude on their rightful maritime zones as well.
So on the big picture, you see all the nations aligning against China.
Aligning against China, because if China is able to claim the entire sea, or almost the entire South China Sea, what will prevent other countries, other naval powers, from claiming the entire seas facing their coast? Then it will be the rule of the naval canon, no longer the rule of law. And I don't think we want that. I don't think any other country wants that.